switch into English. It is my great pleasure to everyone online and also here in Bregenz in Austria to welcome you to this webinar with Professor Katie Aafjes-van Doorn. So this is a webinar that's organized by the Communications Committee of the Society for the Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration. And also here takes place hybridly in Bregenz at the beautiful Lake Constance. We here in Bregenz, we have finished a day, we're just about to finish a day of training and thinking with 4 speakers on artificial intelligence in psychotherapy. It's been productive. And we have just taken a short break, coffee break. It's quite warm today, so I see some people, it's warm, and we're hydrating a lot. And now we're coming to our final closing act with Professor Katie Aafjes-van Doorn, who is Associate Professor of Psychology of NWU Shanghai University. She is the head of the social science and leads there the AI for social good cluster at the AI Center. Her trajectory is truly international. She has a master in clinical psychology at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and then also a PhD in Oxford in the United Kingdom, and has worked for a lengthy time in the United States, including California and New York, where she has been an associate professor at Verkauf Graduate School for Psychology at the Yeshiva University in New York. Now, Dr. Aafjes-van Doorn is associated editor for the APA Journal Clinical Psychology, Science and Practice, and also has co-founded a startup company on deliberate practice using AI. And of course, this is truly a way to connect East and West, as we are connecting with our dear colleague in Shanghai. We have this speaker, of course, is broadcasted all over the world. We have people from North America, from Europe, and also here in Bregenz. Of course, we are very delighted as a team. Markus Böckle and Katharina Kubera and myself are warmly welcoming now Katie Aafjes-van Doorn to take the stage and to start to speak. Just one thing, I want to acknowledge our student helper, Lisa Henner, who is translating for us in German. Thank you, everyone. I think technique is all good. Do you want to add something?
No, thank you. Thanks again for coming, Katie. We're really very much looking forward for the talk. And thank you, Uli. Thank you, Katharina, for this amazing collaboration. And I'm very much looking forward to the future. But now we have this amazing talk. And please, Katie, it's your stage.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I feel
dass
truly
ich hier dabei
honored.
sein darf. Ich bin sehr geehrt.
So yes, thank you for your introduction. Indeed,
Danke
it
vielmals
feels
für
like
die
really nice to
Einleitung.
connect again with Europe.
Sehr schön, dass ich wieder mit
That's all
Europa
good.
in Kontakt
I
haben darf.
wanted to talk with you about making mental health a computational science. And before I start talking, I want to disclose that I'm also a co-founder and director of assessment at Deliberate AI, which is a mental health AI startup company that focuses on ambient measurement. So some of the projects that I'll be talking about are partly done with that team, and other projects are more done with me and my students at the NYU Shanghai University. Now, I want to start with complaining, maybe, as a clinician, thinking about the issues that I see in mental health. Then I want to bring to you a solution, or at least one way of approaching this. And then thinking about it from a clinician perspective, how can we actually apply this? So first of all, if we think about mental health care at the moment, I would say we don't really know where we're starting, because we don't really know what the problem is. Often we take far too long before we are clear on what kind of diagnosis is actually relevant for a patient, or we underdiagnose certain people. For example, men with depression, we don't seem to notice that, or we misdiagnose, right? Or for example, people with bipolar disorder who then first get diagnosed with depression and then get treatment is actually quite unhelpful. So we start with like an unclear picture of what's actually going on. Then there's another issue with lack of engagement.
Probleem met de mangelende engagement.
So, for example, here in China, there's a lot of stigma and lack of awareness of mental health treatment. But even if you are aware of treatment and if you start treatment, chances are that many people actually drop out. So some research suggests even 50% of people might drop out of treatment, which means that you don't get the results that you would get if you were to finish it, and you won't get the benefits of the treatment, right? Now, the other difficulty, I think, in our field is that we don't have enough capacity, right? There are not enough clinicians, not enough mental health centers to be able to provide all the care that people need. Another issue is the lack of quality. So even if we know what the problem is, if we want to provide a treatment, most treatments have very limited effects on most people. Well, we know that some people might really benefit from some particular treatments, but the problem is that we don't know upfront which person would benefit most from which treatment. So we're flying blind a little there. Now, possibly the most important issue, or at least I think it's a clinical issue, is that there's a general lack of accountability in that we don't tend to measure our outcomes. It's quite an awkward field in a way, right? We do what we think is right as long as the patient comes back, where we should be okay. And many clinicians do not use any outcome measure or any tracking of that sort. So I would conclude that we have a measurement problem in our mental health field. Now, before I continue, I want to check in and see if I'm still aligned with the people online and get a sense from you using a poll, just to get a sense of what kind of measurement problems you see in your clinical work and what feels most important. So I'm just going to give the audience a minute or so to respond to this question. Right, I can see the poll on my end, so I'm assuming there will be an answer coming up on the screen soon too. All right, there we go. We see the responses from the poll. So it seems like 50% of people online are convinced that we don't measure outcomes often enough and that is the major issue. And then
Antworten aus dem
we have some, the 27% of people who see difficulty with assessing therapist skills. So there you go. I would argue that all these things on the list are serious problems in our field, but let's see what we can tackle best and what you think at the end of this talk. All right, I'm gonna talk a little bit more about these issues with measurements. In our field, well, as you know, we use a lot of self-report measures, and really they don't capture the complexity of patients' experience. There's so many biases in these self-report measures, right? Generally speaking, do people report more symptoms or lower symptoms? Are they more complainers, or are they people who just have a stiff upper lip and would never report anything? Then we have these scales where how do you decide whether it's a 2 or a 3 on a particular scale? It's very imprecise, right? And then these self-report measures are meant to be used regularly so that you can see if someone changes over time, right? And actually, we know that the sensitivity to change of these measures is very limited. It's also not very objective. If you ask me about my quality of sleep, for example, it might very well depend on my family circumstance or my, the days before. What is normal for me? It's a very subjective type of experience. And as many of you agree, it's not measured frequently enough, right? We don't want to burden patients with self-report measures. It's a burden for the clinician, burden for the patient, but we also don't get enough information regularly. Now, we can do a little better than self-report scales. Oh, sorry, I was first going to show you the self-report scale, the PHQ-9, just to highlight the initial question, even over the last 2 weeks, how often have you been bothered by any of the following problems? And I don't know how good your memory is, but I have no idea exactly, like 2 weeks ago, how I was feeling, which day that was, how many days, and how I would average that for a score here on such a scale. So I don't think we can expect any patients to give a very fair answer to this. But we can do a little better than these self-report measures. So let's talk about that. So we can have clinician-rated scales, right? We can do a Hamilton depression interview, for example, or a Hamilton anxiety interview, or a MADRS. We can have trained clinicians asking these questions with the idea that we get more reliable responses. Of course, we still have reporting biases because we're depending on what the patient reports to us. We still have these same imprecise scales, although now the clinician can weigh in on what exact number on a scale we need to give for a particular symptom pattern. It's still very limited with regards to sensitivity to change and not objective. And now for different reasons, but still all these clinician-rated symptom scales are not measured frequently enough, right? It's very expensive to actually do this, costs a lot of time, so you don't want to burden the clinician or the patient with these types of intensive interviews, which still means that we don't have enough information as a clinician. Now I'll show you these types of HAM-D interviews, which is the gold standard according to the FDA. So this is the best we have in our mental health field. And I've been doing a lot of these HAM-D interviews for different research studies. And actually, I'm still not in agreement all the time on all the different items for a patient. So it's easy enough to say, okay, this person is mild or moderate, but actually to be precise on the exact items and the ratings on each items is another matter. Now, another symptom measure that we can do with a clinical interview, but is still very blunt, I would say, is this Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale, which is also the gold standard being used for the assessment of suicidality, but still hard to conduct and hard to have a reliable, to make into a reliable measurement, really. So this far I've been complaining a little, or about the state of measurements with regards to symptoms. But it's not only symptoms, I think, that are hard to measure. It's also the therapeutic relationship. So between the patient and the clinician, right? How do we measure that? That's also a construct that is very subjective and hard to capture. Here I give you an example of the Working Alliance Inventory, the most common measure used. And you can see how hard it is for a patient to decide whether something is fairly often or sometimes, for example. What's the difference between that exactly? And, for example, for the bond scale, item 9, I feel that the clinician cares about me even when I do things that he or she does not approve of. So what if you don't do things that he or she does not approve of? How do you answer this question? And then, of course, we have all these biases of wanting to please the therapist, wanting to please the therapist, wanting to be nice, wanting to be a nice patient. So how honest is this really going to be reported? So I think another real issue. But then we have another dimension of therapist skills, the assessment of therapist skills, where many of you also agree that this is hard to capture. I think this is an area where we also don't do very well in our measurements. So how do we measure clinical skills, very general, so not particular adherence to a model, but just general counseling skills? Now, there have been some measures that are like self-assessments, so self-report skills. So I can tell you whether I think I have an ability to demonstrate active attending behavior, and I can give myself a score. Now, yeah, you can anticipate how flawed this kind of measurement might be, right? How do I know whether I'm a 3 or a 4? How do I perceive myself? It might say a lot more about how I generally see myself than about my real capabilities as a clinician. So there is a better option, I think, in my experience, which is the FIS, which is a performance-based task and a rating method. And I'll show you a little bit how that works. But this is an alternative way of assessing therapist skill that I think is I guess, as good as it gets. So in this task, the therapist watches standardized clips of simulated clients. So the fact that it's standardized is helpful because then you can actually compare and contrast how different therapists respond to the exact same context, right? Which is never the case in real therapy because you always have unique patients and unique patient moments. So at least this standardizes the task. And then the therapist responds to this stimulus patient. That response is video recorded, and then that video recording is rated in the quality of the therapist skills. Now, that seems to be a more reliable way to assess therapist skill. As you might know, actually, it's still not ideal, right? The reliability of observer coders is still not great. And also, it's so very time intensive that it's not very scalable and usable. So even in sort of our best options for these types of measurements, we don't do that well, I think. We have a lot that we can improve and that we should improve before we can actually think about interventions. Now, maybe I should start to talk about some solutions, right? A little bit more positive. Let's see. So there's work to be done in our field, right? Improving these measurements. Now, I'm not the first one thinking about AI as a particular solution. This is a graph from Simon Goldberg's paper, actually highlighting the increase in the in the research using machine learning and psychotherapy. And indeed, in a scoping review that I did in 2021, there were quite a few studies done that used some machine learning in psychotherapy research, but it was still possible to summarize in one review paper. Whereas if you were to do that now, there's so many studies in the psychotherapy research field that apply AI in one way or another. So it's definitely popular and I think being used a lot. But thus far, I would say it's a lot of proof of concept and a lot of sort of interesting research studies, but that not necessarily generalized to clinical practice. So I would say it's the clinical usefulness is not ideal yet, but it makes us think about solutions. Now, another area of research that has developed over time and that was actually quite promising, I thought, was this whole field of biomarker research, where we're trying to identify biological markers to relate to particular symptoms or diagnoses. And indeed, we found quite a lot of correlations, right, between these things. Now, the problem is that they were actually not as promising as we hoped, like you would have in the precision medicine revolution for oncology, for example. Because although there were correlations, and there are a lot of studies reporting these correlations, those correlations tend to be relatively weak and don't explain a lot of variance. So they are sort of interesting, but they don't do enough to actually build a real prediction model that is clinically useful. Now, the good news is that in the last few years, we've had a few more developments that I think really make a difference and mean that we might now be able to solve these issues better. So first is the really digital sensors that are available nowadays. And I'm sure if I were to be able to see you in person or online, most of you would wear some kind of watch or an Oura ring or some kind of mobile phone where you track your heart rate, for example, your sleep, how you move, and all sorts of things about yourself that are now widely available, sort of cheap, generally used in the general public. So that's a real change in the last few years. Then there's also been a lot of development with regards to the multimodal machine learning, so which means the combination of different modalities of, for example, text and audio and video, and being able to combine all that data. To be able to use that. So for example, the development of transformers and graph neural networks has really changed this field, whereas previously we couldn't actually fuse all these different information pieces, but now we can. And then, of course, the last change in the last few years is all the developments with regards to generative AI, and that we are now able to develop these AI agents and avatars, which means that we can not only develop measurements, possibly more objectively, but we can also provide just-in-time interventions based on these particular measurements in the moment. So these are all super exciting advancements that are very recent. But really what we hope, and this is something that we focus on in the Deliberate company, is that we can really leverage all these technical advancements to build multimodal measurements for mental health that are able to capture all these different pieces of information and build prediction models, build inferences of symptoms, for example. Now, I will want to show you some examples of studies, proof of concept studies, that give you some kind of idea on how we might predict symptom change, alliance, and therapist skills. Let me see. I want to start with how to do that. And as a clinician, I guess I've always been interested in things that are practical. Like I know you can do a lot with EEG, for example, or with very advanced scanners or technology. But actually, ideally, I would just want to do my thing as a clinician, whether it's via teletherapy or in-person treatment, but still being able to use all the technologies. So I want to have it as simple as possible and just use the interactions that I would normally have. And then what we would do is that we would extract all this information that we can get from a recording, whether it's a recording of an in-person session or recording of a teletherapy session. We could extract all sorts of information, not only about how you speak, what you say, the rhythm of your speech, silences, the words you use, but also how you move, your breathing rate, heart rate. There's so much information that you can capture just from a video recording. So literally the quality of a Zoom recording, like that's enough for all this type of information. So if we then apply multimodal machine learning, we can try to predict these three elements, I think, that we need to tackle in our mental health field: the symptom change, alliance, and therapist skill. Now, I want to give you an idea of what that might look like, really, when you capture all this data. So here you see, for example, the facial landmarks and head pose, and then you see loudness and pitch and pulse. And you see it moving just second by second, right? Or even less than that. So there's a lot of information that you can capture even from a very short amount of interaction with the patient. Okay, let me start by talking about the prediction of symptom change. So here is a study that we did where we conducted 130 interviews. So Hamilton depression interviews, MADRS, so that's another depression clinical interview, and Hamilton anxiety interviews. We were really interested in trying to predict this human rating of these interviews. And because we wanted to have the ground truth, as they call it, like as good as it gets, we had multiple people rating these interviews, and we took the median of that. And we applied tenfold cross-validation, which is pretty standard, which means that you split the data in 10 equal groups, and then you train the model on 9 groups, and you make sure that you test the model on the one group that it didn't see before, and you do that 10 times. Now I'll show you what happens when you do these prediction models for the HAM-D and the MADRS and the HAM-A. And you can see here that these correlations are actually pretty good. You see the ICC here, 0.86, 0.82, and 0.92. And just to give you a context of human raters, how reliable they might be, or actually human raters tend to have an ICC of 0.7 or 0.8, or the highest performing rating teams would be 0.9. So the fact that a model like this can agree with the median of human raters to this extent is actually quite promising. It's quite exciting. Now, what I personally find even more interesting than this sort of, good performance metrics is if you think about it in a multimodal way, that if you were to use just text information, you can only predict so much. But then when you add more and more layers to it, so if you start with speech acoustics, for example, so fundamental frequency, how a voice sounds, prosody, that kind of information, that's okay. You can predict the anxiety levels a little bit, but you do better with speech behaviors, which is like the pauses and speech turns, speech rate type of information. And the video does a little better. But then when you combine this type of information, especially when you combine all 3 types of information, you actually get the best model. And this, I think, is interesting for our field where, especially in psychotherapy research, where very little has been done using audio and video, and mostly it's been text thus far. So thinking about how we might be able to combine these different pieces of information to be better at predicting, and so better at creating these automated measurements of symptoms. Let's see. Okay. So I think that means that if you want to increase the reliability, you can move from a patient-reported scale to a clinician-assessed scale. But then you can also make the measure more accurate by not just using one modality of information, but multiple modalities of information. So if we want to do well in measurement, we need to sit in this green corner here. Now, what is interesting in these results so far, in these predictions of anxiety and depression, is that actually it's better than if we just use a screening measure. So, for example, if we use an PHQ-9 to screen for depression, the assumption is that we can infer an Hamilton depression score. And really the ICC with a Hamilton depression would be 0.74. But if we use this AI-based multimodal model, it would be actually much higher. So I think that is exciting just to think about clinical practice where we're so used to using the PHQ-9, but actually maybe we can use video recordings of patients and we can do better. Now, just to give you an indication of the, I guess, future directions in this type of research is that we've also been developing a chatbot version of these HAMD interviews where the chatbot is actually asking the questions and the follow-up questions and making sure that there's enough information to be rated. And then we have an LLM-based text rating. So we're playing around with how to exactly do that and get the best performing ratings that are most aligned with the human ratings of these same interviews. So those are just two ways in which we're trying to make these measurements more scalable, so easier to apply, so that next time when I ask you about issues with not measuring things often enough, you know, if it's easy and cheap, we can apply it often and we would have much more information as a clinician. Okay, well, related to symptoms is the measurement of suicidal risk, which is also important in our field, but a very different kind of measurement challenge. So we don't want to necessarily predict some kind of severity scale like you would do with depression and anxiety, but we want to tackle this challenge where we have many patients with some kind of suicidal ideation, but very few, luckily, who die by suicide, right? So on the one hand, we want to notice when someone expresses some suicidal ideation, but also we want to make sure that we don't sort of get too anxious because most of these patients will not actually die by suicide. So how can we use AI to help us in this kind of decision making? So this is a study example that we did. We conducted these Columbia Suicide Rating Scale 70 interviews. And this was a very special sample from adolescents who had been admitted to the emergency room, which means that they had experiences of suicidal attempts earlier and that they were a uniquely risky sample. So we calculated the composite value, which often happens in suicide research, where we want to have literally one score to say, okay, this person is this level of risky. So 0 would be no wish to be dead, but anything 1 or above, which means some suicidality. right? But obviously, if you have a score of 4 or 5, that would be quite serious with some intent or a specific plan. So you can see here that half of the sample, 48.5%, had at least a score of 1 on this suicide measurement. Now, so what we did is that we wanted to first identify or see if the computer, the AI, can identify if someone is suicidal or not suicidal, right? So a very blunt measure. We use the same tenfold cross-validation. You can see here the area under the curve is 0.75, so that was a performance metric. And for area under the curve, if it would be 0.5, it means it's like chance. If it would be 1, it would be fantastic. Would be a Nature publication, and would be lovely. But 0.75 is not bad at all. And you can see here on this curve that the false positive rate and the true positive rate. So if this were a diagonal line, then that would be chance, right? That would not be so good. But if this line would be vertical, so no false positive rates, but true positive rate would be high, like that would be much better, right? So that's what we're aiming for in this kind of diagram. Now I'll show you what was interesting, I think, in my perspective from this kind of research is besides these performance metrics, it's like, okay, it can predict suicidal ideation. But if we look at the different modalities that are important for that, then we look at a violin chart. So these are the 10 most important features that were needed to make this prediction. And you can see from the list here that it's all starts with NLP, right? So it's all text-based information that is most important to be able to classify someone as suicidal ideation, yes or no. So if you want more detail, really, it's all these different descriptions mean that there is a decrease of active language and an increase of possessive pronoun use. But it's all text-based, right? So I think that's interesting. So maybe it makes sense that we use a lot of text analysis and suicide research so far. But if we then look at another question, and that's actually, can we detect these few patients who are actively suicidal, right, with intent? So that means that they have a score of 4 or more. So I would say clinically, this is far more interesting or, relevant, important for us to be able to identify. So with our model, we could see that the area under the curve is 0.77, so a little better than the previous model. And you can see here on this curve that it's less of a diagonal, right? So it looks a little better with regards to performance metrics. But now it becomes really interesting, I think, if you look at the different features, so all the different type of information that is most useful for this prediction of active suicidality with intent, and you can all of a sudden see the audio, video, audio, video, audio, video. So now we're no longer using the text, right? The text seemed to be less relevant for this kind of prediction, but the audio and video seems to be very important. Now you have here the MFCCS, that's the mel frequency spectrum. It's a representation of the short-term power spectrum of a sound. So this is all the technical knowledge of the things that you can extract from the sounds. But here the Euler angles. Those are rotational angles used to describe the orientation of a body in a 3D shape. So that's really how the body moves within its context. So all this information seems to be far more important for us to capture than the text per se, if we want to predict suicidality with intent. So this is, I think, important for us, or if I think about this as a clinician, I think how great would it be if there is an AI-based measure that can help me identify people who are very risky, so that I don't have to think about this assessment all the time, and I can actually be more therapeutic with my patients, right? If I can be the best that I can be in my therapist role, but I would have some help in doing this kind of suicide attachment assessment with these AI tools, I think that would really help me be a better therapist. Okay, let's move to the next example. So the alliance. So similar to the symptoms and suicide, I've been interested in to see if we can automate this alliance measure. So with the alliance is interesting because it predicts outcomes, right? It's one of the patient-reported working alliance inventories is a very good prediction of patient treatment outcomes. And so the idea is that if I can infer what kind of behaviors are related to these self-reported working alliance inventory, then maybe I don't need to burden the patient anymore with these kind of self-report measures, but I could infer the treatment progress from that. So what we did was a data set of 252 therapy sessions, and we used tenfold cross-validation again. And as you see with the alliance, I'll show you here, it's a little bit more complicated because you have a patient and a clinician. And so we use the patient alliance rating as a ground truth for the model, but you use information from the clinician and from the patient. And so you have the different modalities, the text and the audio and the video, and you have the patient and the clinician. And then, of course, you also need to control for the within person sort of nesting of the sessions within the patients and the patient within the therapist. So it gets a little bit more complicated when you have a dyad, but it's definitely possible to apply this multimodal machine learning sort of measurement. Now I'll show you what we found. We found a Pearson row of 0.70, which is a strong correlation. And you can see here that audio and video, and there's one NLP feature, but it's a combination of different types of information that seems to be important for the prediction of the patient self-reported alliance. And interestingly, these are all patient features. So it seems like those 10 were the most important for the prediction of the patient-reported alliance. But again, the multimodal seems to be an important aspect. Okay, let me see if I can share with you some more information about the therapist skills. So we did a very similar thing for predicting therapist skills. And just to remind you that, or what I used to measure was an FIS task, so a performance-based task and rating method. So that was, those 4 steps, where we have human raters rate the therapist responses to standardized clips. And I want to show you just an example of what such a task looks like, just so you have a sense, and hoping to be a little bit more engaging halfway through. Let me see.
This is Bethany. She is 29 years old and is having trouble making important life decisions. She struggles with feelings of self-doubt and inadequacy and has trouble asserting herself in relationships. This is Bethany's 3rd session, and she has found it difficult to strike up conversation with you in the past. Remember, when the video stops, it's your turn to talk. Say something just as if you were responding to help Bethany as her therapist.
Not quite sure what to say. Maybe there's something that you want me to say, or not quite sure how to start. For you to just be sitting there makes me feel so nervous, like this is some kind of test or something. Yeah, that's kind of how I feel.
Okay, so this is an example of standardized clip. So now I would respond as if I'm the therapist, and I respond for a minute or so to this particular clip. And then that response gets rated on these different FIS dimensions, which really reflect quite common general therapy skills. But the idea is that this is a standardized clip, so it's the same for everyone. And it's a difficult clinical scenario. So this particular patient was more anxious and withdrawn, but there are also examples where patients or these mock patients are very aggressive or want to stop therapy. And then, you need to respond in these scenarios. And so the idea is that if we should all be relatively okay responding to easy patients, but these difficult clinical moments are a better way to assess who's better skill and where are your weaknesses with regards to these different interpersonal skills. Now, what is interesting, I think, about these kind of tasks is that what we've seen so far in our research is that even the fact of just practicing these different types of clips makes us already feel more adequate. We feel a little bit better about what we do. And even the observer-rated skills show that we indeed become a little better in how we respond to these patients just by the fact of practicing. So it seems like being exposed to these kind of difficult moments and practicing makes us a little better prepared for a future patient. So even without any feedback, you can argue just practicing this in a safe space, might already be helpful. Now, of course, my ideal would be that we would also provide an automated measurement of the FIS. So we provide this task, but then also tell you what exactly your level of skill is on all these 8 FIS dimensions. Now, for that research, we did a very similar study where we had 956 of these response clips, so where therapists respond to these mock patients. And we tried to see if we could automate that using this multimodal measurement. And what we found is that we can, to some extent, with a moderate correlation, a Spearman rho of 0.5, 0.6. So it's not as good as the prediction model of the Therapeutic Alliance, but it's a start, I would say. What is interesting, again, when we look at the different modalities, you can see here what happens if you start off with text, which is the most basic type of information, I guess. But then if you add audio and video to the different modalities, you can see that for a lot of the subscales, actually doesn't make much difference, but the red and the green, which is the verbal fluency and emotional expression, actually requires the audio and video information. Right? So if you really want to give someone feedback on their therapeutic skills, text might be helpful for sure, but audio and video is also important. Right? So if we create this kind of feedback, we need this information, the audio and video of how someone is saying it. Okay. So this is again the violin chart with all the different features, and you see here the audio and the text are the ones that are most important. So now you can think about, or at least I'm thinking about, what if we develop this platform where we provide therapists feedback on their skills when we give them these FIS tasks and they do it and we give them feedback straight away. We should at least also have an audio recording of how they say it, right? Now, ideally also the video, but then at least audio to be able to predict the level of FIS. Now, I was also thinking about why is the prediction slightly, the performance a little less amazing than, for example, for the Alliance. And one of the things that I noticed in the data is that a lot of the scores are sort of on the higher end. So all these participants were recruited from randomized controlled training trials that I ran where therapists were trained in how to use their interpersonal skills, how to improve them. But it seems like all the people who are willing to do these kind of trainings are already clinicians who are doing relatively well. So really what I would need to probably improve the model is to ask people who don't know anything about psychology to be able to do these kind of tasks and get some really bad responses, right? So that the AI can learn what it looks like when someone's not so good at all. So that's on my agenda of other research projects that I need to do to be able to make this model better. Here you can see again how how all these labels are spread. So this is the FIS rating from 0 to 5 and the prediction. There you go. Now, another issue that we came across that I also didn't think about when I started this research was that what do you do with these recordings? So these FIS tasks is something that people could do at home, right? Using your own computer. That was one of the benefits of doing these tasks. But then you get recordings like this and you think it's fine. It's just a lady doing this task. But then there is this fan that was moving around. So really what we could see in our data collection was that there was so much movement in this clip that it was crazy high numbers. And then we realized that was actually just because there was a fan going in the background. So now we need to make sure that all the participants who do this, all the therapists who do this, don't ruin the data collection or the feature extraction by having these kind of all things going on. So I'm learning from all these projects and improving my my research skills, let's say. So the next phase in this kind of research is that we are developing a chatbot interaction version of this FIS. So rather than having a one-way stimulus clip and a one-time response, I want to make sure that the patient can then respond to that response and keep the conversation going for a little bit. So it would be a more interactive, realistic practice. So that's something that we are currently developing. And parallel to that, we're also looking into LLM-based ratings of these FIS clips. And there's now the multimodal LLM option. So the hope is that we can still use the audio and video information to be able to provide feedback to the participants. Now, I want to share you a little bit of the struggles of building this type of training platform, this avatar type training for therapists, because I thought a year ago or so, how difficult can it be? I'll ask a computer science students to figure this out and it will be sorted. But I'm still trying to figure this out. So I'll show you one of the things that we tried with using meta-human avatar creation. You can judge how good that is.
Not quite sure what to say. Maybe there's something that you want me to say, or not quite sure how to start. For you, just be sitting there makes me feel so nervous, like this is some kind of test or something. Yeah, that's kind of how I feel.
Okay, so now I can respond So that part works okay. But to be honest, I can't really think of this patient as a real patient, or it's like obviously an avatar. Right? So the question is if this would actually still be helpful, even though it's clearly a little bit more fake. Now, there was another option that we used, or we used a different platform, HeyGen, to build avatars, and we could actually upload a video of the original FIS task to see if we can model that. So here you see another example of the Bethany clip that we tried to create with an avatar, and now she's responding to something that I had just said.
I don't know. That's a good question. Pauses. I mean, maybe my mom, she was always she had very high expectations, and like nothing was ever really good enough, I guess. But I don't want to like blame everything on her or whatever. That feels unfair.
So I don't know what your view is on this type of avatar, but I would say she looks like the exact same as the patient, the real patient. So in that sense, it's far more realistic and less avatar-like. Of course, there are some glitches still that she says, like pauses, for example, or there's some things that we need to figure out. But this would be a more realistic practice avatar, I would think. Now, of course, the dilemma here is that to be able to create this in such a realistic way, the prices are very high. So my ideal of creating a platform where we can practice with multiple avatars and make that freely available for everyone. I'm not sure how to do that yet, but we're trying to figure this out. So I'll show you, we've just been creating a clinical skills lab platform where we can practice with all these different patients, and some are relevant for regular therapy or for teletherapy or suicidal patients, or issues with regards to patient diversity questions. And then this is the type of feedback that we're trying to implement, where you get feedback on these 8 dimensions of the FIS. And you can see over time whether you're improving, what your weaknesses are, where you might want to focus your attention in supervision, for example. So my hope is still that we can do this, and hopefully in a way that is free or almost free, so that many people can benefit from this type of practice tool. Okay, so that was my whirlwind of like technical possibilities, I think, that AI brings to the question of measurement, which I think is all very promising. Whether it's like good enough now, definitely in the next few years, it will be. I'm confident of that. What I'm less confident of is how to really make use of this in a clinical setting. I think the clinical feasibility is possibly the hardest question to answer. So really, the question is then, if this is technically possible, what do we need to be able to implement these AI-based measurements in clinical practice? And I think there are different things that we need to think about. So one is the feasibility of actually collecting this type of data, right? If people are not willing to record measures or record sessions or use measures, then we cannot build these models. So we need some kind of data for that. We also need the clinicians and patients' acceptability, really, but they need to be able to be keen, or at least not against using it. And we want to make sure that we're not harming anyone, of course. So it needs to be ethically feasible. And then I think we also need to address this issue of the cultural feasibility in how all these tools then can be applied to different patient groups and different clinician groups, and how that works. And then think about the implementation feasibility is really, how do we integrate it into our workflow, right? So that it doesn't burden the clinician more than it needs to. Now, thinking about data feasibility first, I've done some reviews earlier and some recent surveys trying to understand from clinicians and patients about their willingness to video record sessions, for example, and their willingness to use ROM or routine outcome monitoring, self-report measures. And it seems that, really the proportion of people who are using measurements of sessions is already relatively small. Then the people who also record their therapy sessions for research purposes is also small. So then assuming that not every quality sessions and measurements is useful, it's a very small proportion of the current clinical practice that we can actually use for AI purposes for developing these models. So that still remains an issue. It's not solved. Then the stakeholder feasibility, I think, is also still an issue. So a few years ago, I conducted a study where I asked a large group of therapists and a large group of patients about whether they would use these type of AI-based measurements that I've just been talking about. So symptom measurements, alliance measurements. And so first of all, really, I wanted to know whether they were open to video recording their sessions, right? Because that's the type of information we would need. And we could see here that patients are actually fine with this. In-person therapy or telehealth, it doesn't matter. Like, sure, you want to record a session if that can make me, have a better treatment, I'm all for it. But therapists were a lot less keen, clearly. Now, when we asked them, the patient and the clinicians, whether the clinician is likely to use these AI-based measurements of alliance, for example, then the patients all thought that that would be used, right? If we develop this, then their clinician would use it. Whereas actually clinicians were a lot less excited about an AI-based measure of alliance. Now, and then we asked the patients and the clinicians how this type of AI-based alliance measure could be used. And it seems that clinicians seem to be open to this kind of measurement for supervision and training purposes, for example, or session-by-session feedback. But actually the patients had far more focus on the personalized treatment plan. So they had the hope that actually their treatment would benefit from getting a more personalized approach. So I think this is also interesting question. Now, going back to these points, next is the ethical feasibility, right? Which is another big issue that we haven't really spoken enough about, I think. So we asked the patients and the therapist about their ethical concerns about these type of measurements. And really, there were 4 buckets of themes. And one is the lack of human connection, right? There was something like a relational aspect that is missing in these types of tools. And a risk of harm. So what if someone expresses suicidal risk, what do we do, right? That seems to be a concern and remains to be a concern. Another aspect was what about the data, right? The privacy storage. And maybe an interesting question also, the lack of accountability, right? So if something goes wrong, who is responsible? Is that the AI tool, AI developer? Is that the clinician? Who is accountable? Now, if we compare these concerns, clinicians versus patients, we can see that the clinicians seem to be more concerned about still being able to provide a therapeutic space. So being able to provide the quality of therapeutic care that they would otherwise provide. But the patient seems to be most concerned about the confidentiality, right? About privacy. So we also have different types of concerns, so to say. With regards to cultural feasibility, this is definitely of interest to me, working currently in Shanghai and having worked in the US for quite a while. And so we did some studies comparing attitudes surveys in clinicians and in patients in the US as well as in China. Specifically, I was interested in how they perceive this alliance in AI-based therapies, for example. And the question whether they have same or different types of expectations with regards to the alliance. And we used the alliance inventory, and we controlled for general attitudes towards AI. And we used the unified theory of acceptance and use of technology measure, which was a measure that we developed specifically to measure attitudes towards AI-based interventions. And what we found is that actually Chinese participants perceive like higher alliance when they think about a chatbot or an avatar providing therapy than the US participants did that. And the US participants rated human teletherapy with a higher alliance. So in my mind, that reflects like the Chinese technology sort of savvy nature and openness to technology and getting a much more relational experience from those interactions. Whereas the US people are more used to teletherapy and can perceive the alliance in there, but not so much in the AI avatar and chatbot. Let me see. I'll just go to the next slide, share a little bit more about these cultural differences. So we also looked at self-determination, which is an aspect relevant for the acceptance of technologies. So the idea is that technology should support 3 basic psychological needs. So the need for autonomy, right? Feeling that it's your own choice. The need for competence, feeling that you're capable and effective when you're using it, and feeling closer, like more connected to people. So we looked at this and we found that actually in feeling connected through technology predicted the acceptance across different types of AI-based therapies much more than the other 2 aspects of self-determination, and especially so in China. So it seems that there is more a relational nuance in their interactions with the technology than there is in the US. So this is definitely something for me to explore, and I know some NYU Shanghai students who are interested in these types of questions. Now, the last point I want to make about implementation feasibility, really, I wish there was an easy answer to that, but I think is that we are currently like not doing enough type of research here, because I feel like there's so many steps that this entails to really make sure that it is feasible. So we not only need to have the right data sets that are realistic, naturalistic, we need to validate them in different contexts, different settings, but we also need to make sure that all these black box, features and models, that they actually translate into feedback tools that are helpful for clinicians, right? That actually tell you then what do you do? What should I do differently? And we need to make sure that whatever tool we build is then integrated in the workflow already, right? It's clinicians are busy enough, so we don't want to actually add any more burden. We want to remove burden and make it all smoothly integrated. And then the last step, and we're definitely not there yet, is to test, well, if we indeed integrate all these AI measurements in the workflow for clinicians, does it indeed improve the outcomes of patients, right? So we need to first build it, and then we need to test whether it actually does, and how we can make sure that these AI-based tools are actually helpful for clinicians. Now, I'm definitely hopeful about this, and especially with regards to the measurement of alliance and symptoms, and being able to create tools that give us information for supervision and for feedback alerts, and also for these interpersonal skills practices with these mock patients. So that was my I guess, conclusion with regards to clinical feasibility. Now, I just want to check before we end, see what you would think at this moment, having listened to all these different technical options and clinical dilemmas, where would you use the AI first? So automated symptom tracking, suicide risk alerts, alliance monitoring, supervision feedback, or synthetic patient training, or maybe honestly not ready yet. All right, let's see what the audience thinks. All right, there we go. All right, we have automated symptom tracking at 22%, supervision feedback 24%, the patient training 27%, and also 16% of people not ready yet. That makes sense. That makes sense. Okay, so a good spread. Maybe not the suicide risk alert yet or the alliance monitoring yet. Okay, that sounds very reasonable to me. Thank you for sharing that. Well, then to end, I just want to provide you with a QR code in case you want to test out some avatar training tools for free. I'm gonna run some tests this summer. So if you are interested in giving it a go, then please leave your email address. And of course, if there's anything that triggers your interest or you disagree with or you want to talk about, I would love to hear from you and think about how this might be relevant for clinical practice, or if there are particular research studies that you're thinking about, I would love to brainstorm with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie, for this wonderful talk. Can you hear me? Yes. Perfect. Based on the time that we have, we can still give one or two questions to you. Is there somebody from the audience in here in Bregenz who wants to ask a question right now? If not, is there a question in the audience at the moment? If you don't have a question right now, I think it was just such a crystal clear and beautiful talk that you gave. I think we had already a lot of information as well, and we are processing it, and it's really amazing. Uli, do you have a question or something you want to
Well, it was just a great talk, Katie. I think it was extremely helpful to hear about what you're up to develop therapist skills. I think that also came up in some of the discussions this afternoon that therapists need more help in getting, just training material to learn, and this is, I think, the future using AI. And my question here would be, and of course, we've seen the limit of the first avatar, but I wonder if you could consider using only audio for instead of just the video, because the video, of course, it doesn't look very convincing. I would agree with your hesitation, but would you consider doing it only with audio, which we have seen examples today during the day, which are quite convincing on a technical level?
Yeah. So I guess you're thinking an patient with text and audio, but not the video. Yeah, I think it's possible. I guess I have my mind set on the video, or making it work, or making it as realistic as possible, so that it comes across as a real patient and not a telephone session, so to say. But that said, I've actually just been piloting some Chinese version of the FIS in China, and we're having a lot of difficulties with getting the video recordings sort of uploaded correctly from the participant, so the therapist. So it might actually be that we cannot record the therapist response with video, but that would be easier with audio. So yeah, I guess we need to play around with these different options and see what is feasible and also financially feasible, and still clinically useful.
Thank you so much. That makes a lot of sense, and hope to see you soon. Thank you for your contribution, Katie Aafjes-van Doorn, this evening or afternoon or morning for some of you. And we say goodbye to those who have joined just for the talk, right? Do you want to end?
Thank you for joining. You still can join. We have a final discussion from the whole day. And maybe it will be interesting for you, but we're going to continue talking in German right now. So thank you for being here. And if you want to stay, Katie, you can also stay, but we'll swap languages. So thanks a lot, Katie, for this amazing talk. And hopefully we'll see each other, and we'll be in contact. Thank you. Ja, vielen herzlichen Dank an alle, die da sind, noch auch im Online und auch hier den langen Tag schon ausgehalten mit all diesen Informationen. Ich möchte noch ein bisschen zum Abschluss vielleicht auch das, was in den Gruppen entstanden ist, in den beiden Gruppen, was Uli und Katharina hier zusammengefasst haben, auch nochmal rückmelden, und gebe euch beiden einfach das Wort für diesen letzten.
Ja.
Ja, also bei unserer Gruppe, also es war erstens mal ganz schöne Feedbacks haben wir bekommen, auch für den heutigen Tag. Also der Workshop war auch sehr gut und auch alle 4 Talks, und war einfach sehr klinisch relevant, und das war so das Erste, was ich festhalten möchte. Da waren ein paar das war die dritte Frage auch, was braucht das Netzwerk denn auch? Natürlich haben einige gesagt, das war schön einfach auch mit den Connections, ne? Aber natürlich auch vielleicht unter dem Jahr, wenn wir uns einmal treffen pro Jahr, dass vielleicht so was wie ein Newsletter entstehen könnte. Das war so eine Idee. Oder halt einfach so regionale Gruppen, ne? Also dass man sich wie in einer kleinen Gruppe vielleicht auch trifft, häufiger, nicht nur einmal pro Jahr. Das waren so die Highlights. Und natürlich haben wir jetzt Themen für die nächsten 10 Jahre, die gebe ich jetzt aber noch nicht aus, weil sonst würden wir noch lange da sein. Und ich habe ja noch ein Slide für nächstes Jahr. Das will ich dann noch präsentieren, aber erst nach dem Feedback, ja. Mhm.
Genau, und in dem Workshop von Herrn Kellmeier das war sehr aus unterschiedlichen Perspektiven bezogen auf Risiken, Chancen der KI, sehr konkret auf ein Beispiel, was in Subgruppen erarbeitet wurde, welchen Zweck die KI dienen soll und welche Risiken zu bedenken sind und das eben aus unterschiedlichen Perspektiven, sodass man nochmal sehr intensiv auch in das Thema Verantwortung, kritisches Hinterfragen tatsächlich gegangen ist. Und in der anschließenden Reflexion ja, ging es auch nochmal darum, welche Themen ja, gerne abgebildet sein könnten. Und da war ein ganz großer Bedarf, so viel üben wie möglich. Also tatsächlich waren das eher Kollegen in Ausbildung, die nochmal gesagt haben, naja, wir wünschen uns ein Üben an herausfordernden Patientenfällen und letztendlich das auch verbunden mit Kompetenzvermittlung, dann auch nochmal als Thema Sexualtherapie, das hatten wir ja auch mal angedacht, ne, dass es einfach immer nicht gut an den Ausbildungsinstituten abgebildet ist und dann auch die sektorenübergreifende Versorgung. Das fand ich auch nochmal sehr schön, wie die Sektoren miteinander verbunden sein können, regional, überregional, dass da nochmal ein integrativer Austausch stattfindet. Und ja, ich fand das sehr schön, dieses Mal, das haben wir neu gemacht, dass wir so in den Dialog mit Ihnen getreten sind, weil wir drei überlegen uns immer, was könnte so interessant sein, aber wir möchten das natürlich von Ihnen hören und erfahrbar machen und auch nochmal das Angebot, auch wenn noch Ideen auch im Verlauf mal aus integrativer Sicht auftauchen, gerne mit uns in Kontakt zu treten. Also wir sind da sehr, sehr offen, auch ne, in den nächsten Jahren da sozusagen ja einfach das gemeinsam zu gestalten, das Programm. Genau, das vielleicht noch dazu. Ja.
Oder hat die Jacqueline? Nein, okay. Waren die zwei Gruppen?
Ja.
Was gibt es denn jetzt noch aus Deutschland?
Genau. Ja, es sind jetzt noch so viele Informationen am Abend. Ich weiß gar nicht, ob das noch so passend ist oder ob wir nicht eher schon einen Ausblick geben. Vielleicht nur ganz, ganz kurz. Wir hatten es anfangs gesagt, dass wir jetzt auch das deutsche Netzwerk gegründet haben, was sozusagen affiliiert ist mit der Universität Heidelberg. Ja, mein Herzensprojekt ist einfach wirklich, Kollegen in Ausbildung zu erreichen und dass sie auch wie so eine Art, ja, nochmal Repräsentation auch auf dem Kongress bekommen und auch da nochmal die Bedürfnisse nochmal sehr klar im Vordergrund stehen, wie das auch hier nochmal ganz gut abgebildet werden kann, gerade in dieser heranwachsenden Gruppe. Ich sage es jetzt einfach mal so. Genau, vielleicht das noch aus deutscher Sicht und genau, das. Absolut. An Jacqueline Scharf nochmal, genau. Vielleicht kommst du jetzt einmal dort nach vorne, oder? Nein, du bleibst hinten. Aber vielen Dank. Ja. Und dass du dich so schön gekümmert hast, auch um die genau, digitalen Teilnehmer, die genau einfach dazugeschaltet waren. Vielen Dank dafür. Genau. Ausblick?
Ausblick oder was? Ich glaube, wir haben alles gesagt. Ja, oder möchte jemand noch einen Kommentar machen? In der Gruppe, ja, noch Kommentare?
Wenig schnell, um das jetzt aufzunehmen mit der Referentin. Aber ich finde diesen abschließenden Vortrag auch noch sehr wie so ein bisschen ein Push. Es ist wie ein Push, weil ich verstehe, dass die Forschung einfach sehr darauf angewiesen ist, dass wir mit diesem AI weitermachen. Das klingt ja total überzeugend, was die Dame macht. Und das, was wir so am Vormittag hatten, war ja eher so ein bisschen auch das Riskante oder also das ist jetzt eine ganz andere Perspektive für mich, finde ich recht erfrischend und wollte ja auch mal sagen.
Es ist uns wirklich ein Anliegen, auch verschiedene Perspektiven, auch schon am Morgen, ja, waren ja auch wirklich ganz unterschiedliche Perspektiven. Und natürlich mit der Katie, sie hat ein eigenes Programm, Forschungsprogramm, und deshalb haben sie eingeladen natürlich hier und danke für das Feedback. Also diverse Perspektiven sind uns immer sehr willkommen an dieser Tagung. Und dann mache ich gleich die Überleitung für nächstes Jahr. Also wir hatten ja vom Anfang an immer wieder auch mit Markus und jetzt auch noch mit Katharina, uns ist ein Anliegen, über den Tellerrand rauszuschauen. Ne? Das heißt beides, dass wir im deutschsprachigen Raum nicht nur in einem Land, sondern wirklich auch in drei Länder versuchen zu verbinden, so Netzwerke verbinden innerhalb der Society for the Exploration of Psychotherapy and Integration, but nicht nur Länder, sondern auch Ansätze zu verbinden und über unseren eigenen Tellerrand hinaus zu schauen oder unseren Berufsstand zum Beispiel hinauszuschauen. Und jetzt sind wir wirklich 6 Jahre lang hier in Bregenz gewesen, hat ganz viele Vorteile und ganz schöne Erinnerungen, nehme ich jetzt auch mit und habe so ein bisschen auch, komme immer wieder gern zurück und ich hoffe, das kommen wir auch wieder in Zukunft. Wir haben uns jetzt entschieden, dass wir mal, das ist ein Nachteil, dass wir hier ein bisschen weit von den Zentren, Universitätszentren weg sind. Und vielleicht ist auch mal gut, wenn wir mal einmal in den großen Städten, größeren Städten sind. Und wir haben uns entschieden, jetzt in 3 Jahren jetzt in die großen Städte der Länder zu gehen. Also, und deshalb habe ich jetzt angeboten, es in die Schweiz zu bringen, diese Tagung. Und deshalb hier die Information, dass wir am Freitag, am 19. März, das ist schon relativ bald in Lausanne, diese nächste Tagung, also die 7. Tagung von INT-Psy 3 in Lausanne vom Bodensee an den Genfersee bringen dürfen mit meinen 2 Kolleginnen. Freut mich sehr, sehr, dass Sie dort auch zu begrüßen. Und Sie denken, warum denn Freitag? Also ich sage Ihnen auch, wenn Sie in die Schweiz kommen, im März liegt Schnee eine Stunde von Lausanne weg. Wenn Sie gerne Skifahren oder einfach die Sonne genießen, die Sonne kann ich nicht garantieren, aber wenn Sie auch den Schnee noch genießen möchten, es ist sehr nahe dabei und dann wäre natürlich sehr naheliegend, dass Sie am Samstag noch ein bisschen den Winter genießen könnten in der Schweiz und aus irgendeiner Art und Weise da noch etwas verbinden könnten, sage ich einfach mal, ne? Oder einfach sonst noch ein bisschen die Stadt oder den See genießen. Ne? Also es liegt so auf der Hand. Wir haben ein schönes Programm und ich habe es auch der ersten Gruppe schon gesagt, das Thema wollen wir noch mal auflegen. Es ist uns am Herzen gelegen, dass wir da nicht nur die an der Oberfläche bleiben, sondern wirklich auch vielleicht jetzt zweimal hintereinander das Thema bearbeiten von künstliche Intelligenz und mit dem Untertitel Die Zukunft der Psychotherapie mit Fragezeichen. Ich glaube, das Fragezeichen ist heute gut hervorgekommen und wollen wir ins 2027 mitnehmen mit allen zusammen. Ne? Und ich hoffe, Sie sind dann auch dabei, wenn Wolfgang Lutz, Andrei Popesis, Rhonda Goldmann, Hannah Levinson mit dabei sind und also ganz andere Speakers. Wir wollen es ganz anders machen und auch eben ganz vielleicht frische Luft auch jetzt zu dem Thema nochmal bringen. Ne? Und da sind Sie alle herzlich eingeladen, hinzufahren. Wir freuen uns schon sehr darauf. Wir machen dann Ende Sommer einen Call. Da können Sie es auch nochmal nachlesen auf unserer Website und auf Ihren E-Mails. Dankeschön. Und kannst du nochmal gleich weiterklicken, weil ich schon am Reden bin. Und wenn Sie schon vorher nach Lausanne kommen möchten, das sind diejenigen, die sich für Persönlichkeitsstörungen interessieren. Das ist nicht jetzt ein Psychotherapie-Kongress, aber wir richten den 8. Kongress der ISSBD aus. Also wenn Sie sich für Persönlichkeitsstörungen interessieren, kommen Sie nach Lausanne. Es ist wirklich der Top-Kongress, wissenschaftlich und klinisch sehr relevant. Sie finden auf der Website von issbd.eu, finden Sie es ein europäischer Kongress zum ersten Mal in der Schweiz. Und wir freuen uns wahnsinnig, über 400 bis jetzt Leute willkommen zu heißen. Und ich hoffe, einige von Ihnen können sich auch da die Zeit nehmen und kommen. Das Programm ist draußen, Sie können es sich anschauen, wirklich sehr interessant. Es hat klinische Workshops, wenn Sie sich mehr für klinische Aspekte interessieren, aber es hat natürlich auch viel Forschungsaspekte. Ich glaube, es gibt auch 1, 2 Symposia zu KI, wenn das wirklich ein Thema ist, das Sie wirklich weiterverfolgen möchten. Aber natürlich ganz viel klinische Fragestellungen, Psychopathologie, Psychotherapie, Neurowissenschaften, aber auch die Stimme von Menschen, die diese Diagnose haben, wird auch explizit in den Plenarräumen da sein. Das haben wir uns dieses Jahr vorgenommen und wollen es auch einlösen, dass wir nicht nur über Persönlichkeitsstörungen sprechen, sondern auch aus der erlebten Erfahrung, sozusagen aus dem Körper einer Person, der Person, die selber an diesen Störungen erkrankt sind und nun jetzt auch eigentlich den Therapeuten ihre oder seine Perspektive geben möchten, auf den Weg geben möchten. Also wenn Sie das nicht verpassen wollen, kommen Sie im September.
Wunderbar, vielen herzlichen Dank, Uli, für die spannenden Vorträge, Kongresse und Tagungen, die noch vor uns liegen. Wir haben wie immer viel zum Besprechen, viel zum Weitergehen, die Forschung weiterzumachen. Aber jetzt ist, glaube ich, gut. Wir sehen das wunderschöne Bild in das kühle, in die kühle Schweiz, wo wir nächstes Jahr im März auch reingehen können. Jetzt gehen wir hinaus in den wunderschönen Sommer da draußen. Ich hoffe, auch Sie im Online haben die Möglichkeit, irgendwo vielleicht noch in den See zu springen. Wir haben den Bregenz, den Bodensee, wo vielleicht manche noch Abkühlung finden können. Und ansonsten wirklich vielen herzlichen Dank fürs Dabeisein und ein schönes Wochenende.